Yes, this meeting is being recorded.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, well, look, thanks everyone for joining us on a beautiful Thursday afternoon. My name is Crystal Legacy. I'm an associate professor of urban planning and also co-director with Ash, Patrick, and Kim of the Informal Urbanism Research Hub. Welcome to our seminar series. Before I kick off, I just want to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Wiradjuri and Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Acknowledge the work of Indigenous knowledges in the Academy and in our collective efforts to care for country and to think about the role of different perspectives, both human and non-human, that we'll hear about today. We're really lucky to have, for many of us, a friend and colleague, Dr. Judy Bush, who's a senior DECRA research fellow. You'll have to tell us what a DECRA is. And is going to be presenting for us on urban informalities in nature in cities. And I look forward to seeing how you make that connection to this wider project of informality that we're interested here in InfUr. But the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Crystal. And gosh. Okay. Thank you for the invitation to speak to InfUr. It's been a really great challenge for me to think about how my research connects. So I hope I make the case today. So I would also like to acknowledge that we are on Wurundjeri country and we are currently in Gulling, which is orchid season, moving soon into Purneet tadpole season. We have Kirsten Paris on the call as well, and Kirsten knows a lot about tadpoles, much more than I do. Anyway, I acknowledge Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of this country that we're on and their care that spans thousands of years and continues on. So the provocation of how to connect nature to InfUr. More than half of us live in cities. By 2050, 2/3 of all humanity will be urban, but what about the non-human residents of our cities and towns? And so that's what I want to talk about today. Does nature belong in cities? And if so, how? So does nature belong in our urban environments? What about I wonder if we can, Tanya's face is partly covering the gorgeous photo of the marbled gecko. So do cute things like marbled geckos, do cute things like radar beetles belong in urban environments? Do they have permission to be there? What about other nature? What about snakes? What about possums? What about when they colonise our houses, like the Currawongs did outside room 341 in our building? What about caterpillars that some people seem to want to spray out of their garden? What about flying foxes that we evicted from the Royal Botanic Gardens? Who of you know paper wasps? Who of you are fearful of paper wasps? We had a paper wasp nest on our house, and when a tradie came by one day, he almost lost his mind. You've got wasps, you've got wasps. And we're like, yeah, they live here. They live in our garden. They eat the caterpillars. But when I Googled for a photo of a paper wasp, every single one of them was related to how to remove the wasp nests, every single one. So, you know, we can see that a whole range of different types of nature does indeed live in our cities, whether we like it or not, whether we've given them permission to or not. But actually also cities are really important for threatened species. So there's research that's been done by Kylie Soames, who's part of Melbourne Centre for Cities, and Pia Lentini, looking at threatened species in Australia and those that are limited to urban areas only. So arguably we can't go with the myth of it's okay, nature's out there beyond the city, we don't need to worry about it in the city. If we are also acknowledging that this is Wurundjeri country, then we also need to think about culturally significant species. And this is taken from an amazing guide from Corranderk, put together by Corranderk. So Corranderk was set up as an Aboriginal mission more than 100 years ago outside Healesville, and it's recently returned to Aboriginal ownership. This really interesting guide goes through and identifies the different culturally significant species in our local area. And there's increasing thinking around culturally significant species and centering that understanding in how we think about and manage biodiversity. So, you know, country, kin, and culture are all connected. So if nature is in our city, where do we find nature? Well, of course, we find it in parks and gardens. We find it in waterways. We find it in reserves. Importantly, we find it in small patches as well. There's often another myth that you need to have a great big space to have biodiversity, but actually there's been increasing research. If you can read the tiny writing at the bottom of the screen, resolving the sloss dilemma. So single large or several small is the dilemma. And there's increasing research showing the value of small patches as well as large patches for biodiversity. Biodiversity is also in spaces that were not designed for it. And, you know, this is a direct connection to informality. Nature is informality. So nature along railway lines, in easements, and so on. And last year, some of us in this faculty, led by Dan Hill, were involved in putting together a report looking at the potential for those utility easements to create a Melbourne biodiversity network. So I've talked about a couple of those urban myths. Nature doesn't belong in the city, or a variation on this. We have urban nature to provide us humans with ecosystem services for healthy, resilient, and livable cities, as long as it doesn't cost too much. And yet, we would argue that we need to challenge that anthropocentrism, and we also need to challenge that nature-culture separation, which is a deeply ingrained part of our culture, and shift towards seeing cities as shared habitats. So what about these undocumented residents of our cities, the geckos and more? How can we think about them and centre them in the planning of our cities, the planning and governance of our cities? Thank you. We could potentially apply an environmental justice framework to think about urban nature and planning for urban nature. And yet it's interesting when we look at how environmental justice is discussed in both research and practice, that it's usually about how people are exposed to environmental bads, or people have access to environmental goods. So environmental bads as in pollution, environmental goods as in access to the benefits of nature. So how can we actually shift environmental justice ideas towards urban nature? So another one of the researchers in our faculty, Melissa Pineda-Pinto, who's a Mackenzie Fellow with us, has done work looking at the idea of ecological justice. So applying the dimensions of environmental justice that centre nature and biodiversity. And so if we think about those 4 dimensions of environmental justice, recognition is about recognising nature's claim to space in cities, claiming space for nature in cities. Distribution, we could argue, is about a multifunctional connected network. So again, recognising that small spaces, large spaces, and connecting those spaces, distributing the habitat capacities across the city. Participation, how do we address ecological justice participation? Arguably, this is about listening for the voice of nature, which I'm going to talk about more. And finally, capabilities. Capabilities is about how to ensure the capacity for thriving, the capacity for livability and thriving. And so this is about ensuring that we provide habitat values, but also that we think about countering ecological traps. Now, ecological traps are related to where we create habitat, but we create it in a way that will either harm the biodiversity or not create the capacity for thriving. So a really good example that is cited there is around stormwater pollution in wetlands, creating conditions that frogs colonise the area but then can't thrive because of the pollution. So we can see that we can apply the ideas of environmental justice to nature in this way. Arguably, one of the hardest of those elements is listening for the voice of nature. And so that's what I want to talk about for the rest of the time. And I think I'm going fine for time. So how do we listen for the voice of urban nature? How do we plan for urban nature? How do we plan for nature in cities? So I have cited a couple of references here, listening to country and listening to trees. And then I'm going to talk about Burrarung Yarra River. But first of all, listening to country, I want to just read briefly from a non-urban reference about listening to country. So this is from the first reference, Boaka country, co-becoming Boaka. We invite readers to dig for Ganguri, which are yams, at and with Boaka, an Indigenous homeland in Northern Australia. And in doing so, consider an Indigenous-led understanding of relational space-place. We draw on the concept of Gurutu to illustrate the limits of Western ontologies, open up possibilities for other ways of thinking and theorising, and give detail and depth to the notion of space-place as emergent co-becoming. With Boaka as lead author, we look to country for what it can teach us about how all views of space are situated and for the insights it offers about co-becoming in a relational world. So I read that because I think it's super interesting for many reasons. It talks about relational space, place, and a relational world. And it's a paper that is lead authored by country. And it talks about listening to country and learning with country. I invite you to look up the Paul and Laird paper, which is a paper from Aotearoa, New Zealand, about stories from trees. And I'm now going to talk about listening to rivers, and in particular, Burrarung Yarra River. So probably all of you know Burrarung Yarra River. It's the river that flows through our city, a river of mists and shadows, 242 kilometres long, from the Great Dividing Range through suburbia, and then through our inner city, and then into Port Phillip Bay. Of course, it's facing many urbanisation challenges, pollution, urban development, freeways. So freeways have already been built along Birrarung, but horrifyingly, at the moment, the Northeast Link is being constructed, and the impact in that area is just horrific. Climate change impacts are also obviously not limited to urban areas, but definitely a key challenge for Birrarung Yarra River and planners and planning. So the reason I would like to talk about Birrarung is because of this Act of Parliament. So this is an act of Victorian Parliament, the Yarra River Protection Willipgin Birrarung Murrun Act 2017. So this is a groundbreaking for Australia piece of legislation. It acknowledges the river as one living integrated natural entity for protection and improvement. It includes traditional owners' language in the legislation's title and preamble, and it's the first piece of Australian legislation that actually does include traditional owner language. It sets up a statutory body, the Birrarung Council, to provide a voice for Birrarung. And the statutory body acts as an advisory and advocacy body. It doesn't have specific power, but it advises and advocates. And the council membership, it's required that there are traditional owners on the council membership. The Act was also significant in that traditional owners were invited onto the floor of Parliament to read the preamble. I think it was the second reading of the bill. And again, this is really significant because the floor of Parliament is usually restricted to elected members only. So if you're if you're not elected as a member of Parliament, then you've got to sit in the visitors gallery. But significantly, traditional owners were invited onto the floor of Parliament to read the preamble. And you can watch a recording of it at that YouTube clip. So the Act enables for the first time a river in Australia's history for a river to be legally understood as a living system. And so it joins a number of other rivers around the world that are similarly recognised. And it's been described as groundbreaking legislation because it does set up organisations and agencies to explicitly think about their relationship with the river, as well as establishing various processes and so on. It's also filtered down from legislation to strategic planning and then statutory planning. So from the Yarra River Protection Willipgin Birrarung Murrun Act in 2017, we have Burned Up Birrarung, Burned Up Umaku, Yarra River Strategic Plan that was put out in February 2022, so 5 years later. And then VC 281, Amendment VC 281, came through in April 2025. And so that planning scheme amendment changed clauses in both the regional planning provisions and local planning provisions of all the councils in the Yarra catchment, which also includes the tributaries. So it also includes Mary Creek catchment, Gardeners Creek catchment, and so on. So how does that drill down? What's it look like? Let's have a look at a little section of Birrarung. Let's think about the Green Line case study. So This is a photo of Birrarung looking down sort of towards Flinders Street. Can you all orient yourself? I can't remember where I was standing. A tall building somewhere on the South Bank. So Green Line. We have a Green Line master plan. We have Green Line fancy artists' renders that show us how Green Line might transform the north bank of Yarra River, Birrarung. More fancy artists' renders, which, yeah. And yet, even though it is encompassed and framed on a vision of transformation and high ambition, it has, of course, faced a number of project challenges, not least that it's looking at, I think, a 4-kilometre section of Birrarung right in the centre of city. And so the issues around ownership, management, services and utilities are colossal and complex. I went on a guided walk with some of the City of Melbourne staff who've been involved in this, developing this project, and they were saying there are more than 100 owners and land managers involved in that 4-kilometre section. So that is a massively complex undertaking to think about how to restore that area. Obviously, there are huge access constraints. Think back to the photo that I showed you of the train line and buildings and so on. And anything this complex is going to cost lots of money. And indeed, funding has been a really big challenge. This is an article from 2024, May 2024, when Council's 2024-25 budget was unveiled, and it involved budget cuts to Green Line. And you can see this article here from The Age. Green Line is framed as Sally Cap, so the Lord Mayor, Sally Cap's passion project, which sort of suggests, you know, that it's a crazy pie in the sky idea. Some of the backstory to that passion project idea is suggestions that Sally Cap was so inspired by Highline in New York that she came back and said, we need something like that, and it translated into Green Line. Anyway, so we can see here that in 2024-25 budget, there was a cut to Green Line's funding, and then in this year's budget, there was additional cuts. And we can see this media article from May this year, where City of Melbourne are blaming state and Commonwealth government for lack of matching funding, which again reflects the complexity of the project. After those funding cuts contained in the budget, there were then some interesting posts, social media posts. This quote here, the river being cut off is very much my point. And until that's resolved, I really don't think the fancy greening makes sense at all. So, you know, this real sense of a passion project and, you know, can we really justify this much money for greening this area? Following the release of the budget, one of the City of Melbourne councillors then put up a motion to the Future Melbourne Committee saying we should just ditch this project altogether. And so there was debate at the Future Melbourne Committee meeting in May, and it was, you can see here on the screen, City of Melbourne councillors voted overwhelmingly to reaffirm its commitment to deliver Green Line by defeating the motion. Whilst it won't be completed this council term, and that's okay, we will continue to deliver various stages as funds become available. So, yeah. Other people have said the Green Line project is one of the most transformative initiatives council has put on the council's agenda. And at its heart, the Green Line project is about reconnecting our city with the river culturally, ecologically, and socially. So, really, I think the Green Line project is a super interesting case study because it really highlights the complexity, the governance complexity of governing and managing for and with nature, and particularly for sites like Birrarung, particularly in this inner area, whose role should it be? Is my question. I actually think City of Melbourne is the best placed to be able to play a coordinating role to try and progress this process. The other key reflection that I have from the discussions and the critiques and so on is that for many of them, they're still planning from the street rather than from the river. And how would it look different if we were actually sitting on the river or in the river and thinking about Green Line from that perspective, which is what I've tried to show here in these photos. So you can see floating wetlands, which are part of the sort of first stages of Green Line. This is City of Melbourne trying to recreate some of those sorts of ecosystems in inner Melbourne. And I also wanted to show you the litter trap and the crap that we throw into our waterways and expect our cormorants to swim in. I love Birrarung. I hope you are interested in Birrarung from me having talked about it. Yarra Riverkeeper Association are in the midst of organising their second Birrarung Riverfest, which goes from 6th of September to 28th September, and you can get onto the river and into the river as part of Riverfest. So, final thoughts, just to wrap up, and plenty of time. Final thoughts. So I'm definitely not talking about rewilding. What I'm talking about is renaturing or biocultural restoration. The reason why I'm saying renaturing and biocultural restoration is because I've been asked to by the traditional custodians of Australia. So traditional custodians, Aboriginal people have talked about and written about the fact that Australia and its biodiversity, its ecosystems are cultural landscapes. They have been actively managed for thousands of years. They have never been wild. They are not wild now. They are actively managed landscapes. And so I've cited Zena Cumpston, who I worked with as part of the Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub. She's a Bakanji woman. She suggested the word renaturing. Likewise, Michael Sean Fletcher, who's a professor here in our university and a First Nations man, he asks us to think about the term biocultural restoration. So I offer those ideas to all of you here. So I thought I'd finish by saying, oh, hey, and this is my DECRA. So DECRA, you asked me to define what a DECRA is. It is a Discovery Early Career Researcher Award given by the Australian Research Council, 3-year research fellowship. And I am looking at nature-based solutions for the climate-biodiversity nexus in cities. And I am interested in different scales. I'm interested in what happens at the street scale and also what happens at the waterway scale, but not just the waterway as corridor. I'm interested in the waterway as catchment. And remember when I said the Birrarung Planning Scheme Amendment covers all these councils for all, the catchment of Birrarung. And then I'm interested in city and landscape connectivity. I'm looking at governance, at implementation and collaborative governance models. So you can see why I've been talking about Birrarung. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Judy. That was fabulous. It was also really great to hear more about your research and the lovely connection into informality and the broader conversations we're having in our hub. This is an opportunity to offer questions, reflections, thoughts. Those online, please let me know if you've got a question and we'll definitely give you that opportunity. Likewise, those of us in this room. Hands up, who'd like to go first? Please.
Thanks a lot, Judy, for your nice presentation. And I really enjoy the part that you're arguing for that nature have a place in cities. And I wonder, how would you define what is nature? This is my question.
Good question. Thank you. So there's probably a million different definitions of nature. I would say nature is biodiversity and the habitat that it depends on. So what I mean by that, biodiversity is plants and animals, but it's also, fungi and blah, blah, blah. We can look to the Convention on Biological Diversity for a definition of biodiversity. But nature also requires, the soil, the water, that's all, biodiversity requires that. So that's all part of nature. But also we are part of nature, right?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the answer, because I think the understanding of what is nature is so fundamental for what we do next.
Next question. Who'd like to go? Brana, yes, please.
Hi, it was very interesting to hear about nature as a living fabric almost in the city. And from your presentation, I can get a very clear idea that there is a nature-culture nexus. And since I also researched on cultural landscapes, I mean, it is very important that the traditional and cultural practices of the Woiwurrung people or the original people, elders of the land, in maintaining the natural connections. So how many of these festivals and traditional rituals are still celebrated, if I may know? Because originally the people devised these festivals as a way of continuing sustaining the natural fabric. And that is one of the ways, and we can both protect, conserve culture and nature. It's like two targets with one arrow that hit. And I mean, how many of these traditional festivals and rituals are still celebrated?
I'm not a traditional owner. I am hesitant to speak. Well, I can't speak on their behalf. However, I would point to a rich cultural life that includes tradition and connection every day. The Riverfest that I showed on the screen is organised by the Yarra Riverkeeper Association. So they're not a First Nations group. There are a bunch of events and activities within Riverfest that involve traditional owners. So look it up. Great. I've registered for, I don't know, I went a bit crazy. I registered for a lot. But every time there is a smoking ceremony, we are invited to participate in those rituals and festivals as well, or, rituals and connections. Yeah.
It's very interesting, just to add to it, because I have in my personal PhD, I have researched on the cultural landscape in Calcutta, which happened to be in India, British capital house. And one of the challenges which I saw that the conflict was there was an existing nature-culture relationship. And with the colonization, some new ethos were invented. I mean, what were implemented on the land, which sort of broke this, the planning strategies of the city, like laying out the grid and everything, somewhere those connections were cut off. And I think that this is something which probably Australia is also battling with. I'm not sure. But then as long as those roots, as long as the people are still, like in my case, is still going and doing their rituals in the river, bathing in the river, acknowledging the river as a living goddess or whatever, I think the same thing can support conservation of these natural flows to much extent.
Other questions? Victor, please.
Thanks for the presentation. Can you reflect about the, I can see nature as no boundaries, it's just continuity. And we as designers, planners, think that our task is to put boundaries, or we work within that kind of boundaries, legal, spatial. How this, can you reflect about that in the case of the river, maybe, or how nature can help us to think informally in a way?
I mean, I think it's thoroughly challenging, and I don't necessarily have answers. I was talking to someone about this talk and thinking about what I was going to be presenting, and said something about snakes and possums, and they went, yeah, well, I wouldn't want a snake in my house, and neither would I. So yeah, I think boundaries are important. Urban planning absolutely thinks about boundaries and edges and connections and so on. I think the challenge is for us to learn how to listen to nature and how to foreground it as, not just there for us, but also for its, and also acknowledge the unruliness of it and the potential lack of ability to always control it. So this is a non-answer to your question.
It's a good question. I'm going to go to Kirsten online, and then we'll come to Merritt. Kirsten, please feel free to ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, Chris.
Thanks. Hi, Judy. Hi, everybody. Thanks for a great presentation. I really enjoyed your provocation regarding multi-species justice in the city. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions about how we might progress that for actual living species, in addition to the living body of the Birrarung.
Yeah, I mean, as a planner, it would be interesting to think about what it means for example, in the planning scheme, how we frame biodiversity in clause 12.03 or whatever, it gives us a framework to actually be able to structure that thinking, doesn't it? And to actually, but at the same time, it's a completely different way of thinking about cities and thinking about planning. So I'm not sure how it would work. I think the Birrarung gives us an amazing opportunity to actually start trying it out. The Birrarung Act is now leading to the organisations along the river having to write statements of relationship with the river. So that's a pretty good way for state government departments, Melbourne Water, local councils to start thinking about what their relationship to river and biodiversity and nature is. So I think the potential power and influence of the Birrarung Act is in its sort of ongoing pushing us to declare a relationship.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen, for your question. Now there's a question. Merrick, you had your hand up.
Yeah, hey Judy, thanks for the presentation. My question builds on Victor's and that idea of boundaries. I see a tension going on there with the Yarra River Protection Act and legislation tries to be precise and clear. And then you pointed out just before the Yarra River is unruly. There's an unruliness going on. And so I'm really interested to hear more of your thoughts about that tension going on and whether that's something you'll be pursuing over the next couple of years in your research.
I mean, you know, one of the tensions, and so, yeah, one of the tensions is for rivers that have been given personhood. So Birrarung Act doesn't go to the full extent of personhood. It recognises Birrarung as a single natural living entity. It doesn't assign personhood in the way that New Zealand legislation and Indian legislation, for example, has done. And I think legislation in Ecuador as well. For some of those pieces of legislation that go that extra step, there are then questions about whether the river can be held liable for damages from flooding and so on. And so that is a question that I won't be engaging with because I'm not a lawyer. But I know that there are a whole range of sort of issues that come out of that. And in some ways I want to reflect the question back to the members of InfUr and ask what you think. I'm interested in a bit of a dialogue to, you know, how you think those boundaries, that messiness can be navigated and understood. Kim.
Well, there was an invitation.
Yeah,
right there.
sure. I'll sit down.
I'll have a go. Look, first of all, thanks very much for a really stimulating presentation. Really interesting. I love the title. You know, of all of the papers I get asked to review that I say, oh, I really don't have time. I think I would be attracted simply by the title because the promise is really great. Nature as informative. So I'd stress the as. In a sense, you held up a promise there, which I'm not entirely sure you've delivered yet. But I'd love to see that paper that actually makes that case of the real connection between informality. Now, informality is like a bit different. I've kind of been struggling with looking at a lot of ancient cities where the historians have always looked at these cities and said, oh, they're organic, right? That's what they call them. And I've always said, well, actually, they're cities, you know. Cities are not natural, which is kind of what organic largely means. They're artificial. They're the most artificial things on the planet, really. And you call them organic. And that's another way of saying, oh, well, they were unplanned. Well, they're not actually unplanned either. I mean, they were planned. Lots and lots of people over a very long period of time. They just don't look formal. They're just not based on grids and so on. So those are the thoughts that what you're saying brings to me. And it is about this interrelationship between, if you like, the formalities of the city and its structures. But then you leapt fairly quickly into a kind of discussion of formality, which is what legislation is. Legislation is something that is imposed by a state on top of the land. And so what I found most provocative, though, you talking about is that it stimulates a fundamentally different way of thinking, where land is not something that is owned, if you like, or even then designed or planned so much as the ground upon which our life depends in the first place. And our lives are only, don't exist in some kind of flat ontology with all of the other species on this beautiful planet, right? So to me, that's what it made me think about. But it also made me think about issues of scale, because you were going to the larger scale, which I really like, multi-scale thinking, which is, to me, is fundamental. The whole, you look at the whole river and all its tributaries, and then you also look right down at the nitty-gritty. Like, I became really interested in these floating wetlands and so on, which I've seen, which I think are great. I'd like to go even further down and start to look at pavement. So much, our cities, we don't need to pave them the way we do. We can make them permeable. We can let the water go through back into the land. That'll become the nourishment for so much more nature and so on. So look, that's not a question.
And thank you. I was thinking about the leap into planning, and I was thinking it reflects me as a, pragmatic planner. Like, all this stuff, but what does it mean? How do we apply it? And so that was my attempt to bridge that, because I think how do we, and maybe connecting a bit with Kirsten's question, how do we go from the cities of today to relational processes? And maybe we can find our way by looking at that. But yeah, thank you. Yeah,
I was thinking also, Min, and we've got Sangeeta online, but I'm just going to jump right in with just to pick up Kim's point about the jumping into the formality with sort of legal processes, but also we're trying to grapple with and infer, the binary that informality and formality sets up, right? But I think what you're also presenting, particularly in highlighting relationality and sort of, management systems or management practices, are degrees of formality, and who owns those practices is itself a question that can clarify, big F, small f, formality and formality from all kinds of different angles as it intersects and is interdependent with informality as well. So that's kind of what I was hearing a little bit in your response to Kim's question and in your presentation as well. Sangeeta has a question online. Sangeeta, would you like to share your question and pop up?
Sure. Thanks so much, Judy, for the presentation. I was interested in fire and where it fits into your analysis, particularly using the environmental and multi-species justice lens. Just thinking about fire as a really critical enabler of biodiversity, or nature, as you've used the term. How do you bring fire into this and think about fire in the context of our climate changed cities?
My first response is thinking about burning grasslands on Merry Creek, and actually, to be honest, burning my nature strip in Northcote. I think the NARRP team, which Wurundjeri's ranger team, have been bringing cultural burns back to grasslands on Wurundjeri country. They did a burn at Bolan Bolan Billabong in February. It does raise really interesting questions, fire in urban areas, and the risk aversion of state government departments. And it was interesting talking to one person who said, it's lucky this is Crown land because DECRA have got are less risk averse than Parks Vic, for example. So yeah, I think this is an amazing opportunity to continue a depth of relationship.
Thanks. Do you think there are some tensions that come up in thinking about this from a kind of nature conservation perspective, but trying to bring fire more into the planning process?
I mean, there are huge tensions from really practical perspectives. The idea of waterways being fire wicks into the centre of cities is, you know, scary ideas. I think none of us have really talked about climate change and what that means for species assemblages and ecological processes. That's another huge challenge. Yeah.
Thanks, Sankita. Min had his hand up, and then Anitra has a question as well. So we'll go with Min first.
Yeah, thank you very much for your nice presentation. I'm curious about the concept. Your DECRA is about nature-based solutions, and your presentation ends up with renaturalization. How do you define those things? Do you think these two things are interchangeable, or nature-based solutions are something bigger and renaturalization?
Yeah. So I would take the definition of IUCN, International Union of Conservation for Nature, and their definition of nature-based solutions is nature-based solutions to address societal challenges that benefit both people and biodiversity. And the societal challenges are climate change, food security, water security, economic security, health and well-being. So I think that nature-based solutions are a subset of nature. And they're very definitely human processes to intervene and create ecosystem-based responses. So I didn't talk about nature-based solutions until my very last slide, when I wanted to tell you what my DECRA was about. And I used nature-based solutions to frame it because I think it's an increasingly recognised way of thinking about nature, climate change responses.
Thanks, Min. Anitra, we're going to give you the last question, which was a bit of a comment, less a question, but please.
Yeah. I just wanted to comment that some of the degrowth literature frames these kinds of ecological concerns of yours, Judy, following the kind of right to the city movement in terms of like a right to metabolism and degrowth justice. And sort of course, in that kind of framework, it's a strongly participatory grassroots approach that they see as necessary to enact such a holistic kind of advance. And just as a comment, I describe degrowth as intentional informality. And I think that's actually got some resonances with your perspective. So I might email you a bit about that and we could discuss it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anitra. Well, we're going to call it to a close. A few housekeeping things. As is in first practice, we're going to go live and have a drink. And I hope you will come and join us. And Judy's going to be there. And you can ask Judy more questions and engage her further in her fascinating work. But also join me now in thanking Judy for great presentations tonight. Thanks everyone for coming along today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone online. Bye.
Yeah,